Recently, someone had asked me if I would look into metformin as a possible anti-aging drug, and so I just spent the last week looking at the research on that topic. I was so intrigued with what I found, I did a whole podcast episode on it, and for you on YouTube watching me right now, here are some of the highlights of what I uncovered. Let's go. Now, before we go any further, what is metformin? You're probably aware of this already, but it is a diabetes medication. It's used for people predominantly who have type 2 diabetes as well as prediabetes, and it helps our insulin work better. The better insulin works, the better it is at lowering blood sugar. It also appears to have some antioxidant effects as well as some anti-cancer effects as well. Now, it's been around since the 1920s, been in France, used as a diabetes drug since the 1950s, been used in America since the mid-1990s as a diabetes medication. It's interesting, the herb for which metformin has been derived has been used since the mid-1600s for a variety of issues, including lowering blood sugar. Now, people have gotten interested in metformin because of research like this. This study came out in 2017. Metformin reduces all-cause mortality and diseases of aging independent of its effects on diabetes control, a systematic review and meta-analysis. In other words, it seems to have effects that have nothing to do with its effect on blood sugar control. These researchers looked at 53 previous metformin studies, and they conclude that when diabetics are taking metformin, they had a lower risk of dying from everything compared to non-diabetics, so-called healthy people. All right. And in addition to that, diabetics taking metformin, again, had a lower risk of dying from everything compared to diabetics that were taking other diabetes therapies like insulin, sulfonylurea, etc. Now, these researchers had a very interesting final sentence in this summary, which I'll read you here. The apparent reductions in all-cause mortality and diseases of aging associated with metformin use suggest that metformin could be extending life and health spans by acting as a geroprotective agent. That word geroprotective got my attention because gero means old age, aging process. Basically, what they're saying here is that metformin could be an aging process, disease-modifying medication. And that has gotten people very interested in this drug, as well as some other medications in the pipeline, as a possible, I'll say it, cure for the aging process. So as I delved more into this, I found some additional research, and I want to bring them to your attention right now to help you put these things into perspective. So what do we got? The animal research is interesting and worthy of bringing this up to you. When you give metformin to mice, they live longer. When you give metformin to worms, they live longer too. However, when you give metformin to rats, they don't live longer, does not increase their lifespan. And when you give it to fruit flies, they also don't live longer either. As a matter of fact, higher concentration of metformin were actually toxic to the fruit flies. So this leaves open the possibility that if metformin is a aging syndrome modifying medication, then its effects may be dependent on what we're talking about: rats, mice, worms, fruit flies, etc. Now, what do we got in terms of human research? Because we're not flies and worms, we're people. And I can tell you, unfortunately, that right now there are no human clinical trials of metformin extending the human lifespan, making us live longer. With the exception of that study I mentioned a little bit ago about the diabetics, I can't find any studies of healthy people taking metformin living longer. It's going to be a very difficult study to do. We live so long, thank goodness, that it's a very difficult investigation to do. Now, we've got some intriguing writing on the wall here. This study came out in 2018. Metformin regulates metabolic and non-metabolic pathways in skeletal muscle and subcutaneous fat tissue in older adults. This study, if you're familiar with it, goes by the name MILS, M-I-L-S. It was originally called. That's the Metformin in Longevity study. And again, longevity makes you think that it helps people live longer. This was an investigation of 14 people. They either took metformin for 6 weeks or a placebo for 6 weeks, and they found that when these older adults took metformin, that several genes in their muscles and in their fat cells changed how they work, changed their expression. And that's quite interesting, however. But again, I like to point out that despite the longevity name in that original title, it didn't prove that anybody lived any longer. It just said their genes are expressed differently. So again, metformin appears to have some epigenetic effects, seems to alter the gene function, and that's very interesting. But in terms of helping us live longer, unfortunately right now, despite the hype, there just is not any conclusive evidence one way or another. So this is a quick video, guys. This summarizes a lot of what I found. Again, hopefully that answers some of your questions, probably raises some questions as well. So if you got any questions or comments, leave them below, and I will answer them to the best of my capabilities myself. Don't forget to subscribe and like. Until next time, gang, I'm Joe Cannon. Go out, take care, and make a difference.